I've set myself a simple in inverted commas, task this evening, which is to answer a question. Can this be the Asian century? In 1988, Deng Xiaoping, then the paramount leader of China, met Rajiv Gandhi, then Prime Minister of India, and told him, and I quote, "In recent years, people have been saying that the next century will be the century of Asia and the Pacific, as if that were sure to be the case. I disagree with this view." End quote. I start with this sobering assessment from China's greatest modern leader, at least in my opinion, because 35 years on, the idea that the 21st century will be Asian, just as the 20th century was supposed to have been American, is too often regarded as axiomatic, that is, taken as self-evident and thus more often repeated than examined. The idea that the 21st century will be Asian is in fact a simplistic and often politically motivated trope that ignores complex realities. My purpose this evening is to add some of those complexities to the discussion. And I thank the Asia Society of Switzerland and the University of Zurich for giving me the opportunity to do so. A special thanks to President Michael Shepman for his very kind, overly kind introduction. I hope that having heard me, you all do not conclude that it was an act of reckless folly on his part. I'll make my argument in very broad strokes to leave details to question time. There have indeed been important global shifts in which Asia has played a disproportionate role. But to attach a geographical adjective to these shifts conceals much more than illuminates. The proposition that an Asian century will replace or already has replaced an American century is flawed both in its underlying premises and factually. Apart from the conventional geographical sense of the term as one of the 7 continents, Asia is too broad a category to have any coherent political or strategic meaning. It is more accurate to say that certain specific Asian countries or leaders from these countries have played disproportionate roles in global shifts of power and ideas, and this has been going on in different ways since the earlier 20th century, when Imperial Japan defeated Imperial Russia in 1905. Now, it will be tedious for me to repeat this qualification every time I use the word Asia, but bear it in mind. One of the earliest uses of the phrase the Asian century that I am aware of was the title of a book by the Dutch historian Jan Roman, first published in 1956, about the rise of nationalism in Asia. In this process, Japan's defeat of Russia had a significant influence. At other times and in different ways, leaders from India, Indonesia, Malaysia, both Koreas, Vietnam, among others, even my own tiny city-state, Singapore, have been associated with the impact of Asia on the world. Today, Asia is often a code name for China, particularly among the most enthusiastic proponents of the idea of an Asian century. On China, more later, but there are serious conceptual and historical difficulties with associating an entire political era or order with any single country or continent, because it imposes a unity of thought and purpose that often simply does not exist. The long European century, something like 200 to 300 years if you date it from the colonial systems that began to take root in the late 17th century, reached full bloom in the 19th century and lingered on until the second half of the 20th century. That long European century was rife with intra-European rivalries, and it was those rivalries that often propelled Europe to expand their empires globally. American intervention in the First World War in 1917 may have marked the beginning of the end of the European era, but a US internally divided about its global role soon returned to its own preoccupations, allowing Europe a reprieve of a few more decades. So when Henry Luce, publisher of the influential Life magazine, wrote an editorial entitled The American Century in February 1941, it was still more an exhortation to his compatriots to play an active role in resisting dictatorships than the description of an established American order. If there was indeed an American century, it was a very short century of about 67 years, from December 1941, when the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor brought the US into the Second World War, to 2008, when the global financial crisis catalyzed widespread disillusionment with US-led globalization, including among many Americans. Competition is an inherent characteristic of any system of sovereign states, and competition too often becomes conflict. It is a fundamental mistake to think that any international order or era, whether geographically defined or not, is necessarily uncontested or even peaceful. The so-called American century was never uncontested. For 40 of the 67 years of the so-called American century, it was the contest between the US and the former Soviet Union and their proxies that defined international order. The Cold War was messy, the contest was often dangerous, but it was the only order we had. It was only a short and historically exceptional period of about 20 years or so from 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, that the harsh reality of inherent competition and conflict was masked by the overwhelming dominance of US power, and the US alone seemed to define the international order. That period was beneficial for most of us, particularly in Asia, but that does not make it any less exceptional or make it replicable. We are now back to a more historically normal period of world history, where the contest defines the order. And that brings me back to China. In his conversation with Rajiv Gandhi, Deng Xiaoping argued that excluding the US, the only countries in the Asia-Pacific that were relatively developed were Japan, the four little dragons of South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, as well as Australia and New Zealand. Even if the western regions of the US and Canada and the far eastern regions of the Soviet Union were included, this was only a small percentage of the region's population, dwarfed by the populations of China and India. Deng concluded, and I quote, "No genuine Asia-Pacific century or Asian century can come until China, India, and other neighboring countries are developed." Now, of course, economic conditions today are different from 1988. You all know the statistics, but a quick reminder is in order. The IMF has estimated that this year, in PPP, purchasing power parity terms, China was 19.3% of world GDP, the US 14.8%, India 8.2%, Japan 3.4%, South Korea 1.6%, Indonesia 2.6%, and Australia just under 1%. A total of over 50% of world GDP for the Asia-Pacific, slightly more than 40% if you exclude the US. There are good reasons not to exclude the US, and I will deal with them later. But with or without the US, we should be cautious about arriving at conclusions about political and strategic influence from straight-line extrapolations from economic weight. Not stated explicitly but clear enough in Deng's conversation with Rajiv Gandhi was that China and India should not just have to grow together, but work together. In a press article for his first visit to India in 2014, Xi Jinping himself explicitly wrote, and I quote, "I am confident that as long as China and India work together, the Asian century of prosperity and renewal will surely arrive at an early date." End quote. China and India work together to make an Asian century. Well, the exact opposite happened. By my very rough count, since 2014 to date, there have been at least 10 serious incidents, some resulting in fatalities, on the Sino-Indian line of actual control in the Himalayas. The first occurred within weeks of Xi's visit. There would probably be considerably more if minor incidents not always reported in the media are included. China has deployed 200,000 troops to its Western Theater Command, which is responsible for its border with India, which has in turn resulted in a buildup of forces on the Indian side. Both sides are enhancing their military infrastructure along the line of actual control. And it's not just the Himalayas. The most active disputes in Asia all involve China, in the East and South China Seas, and of course, most potentially dangerous of all, over Taiwan. Relations among the countries of Asia are complicated, often with China at the center of many of the complications, which given China's long history is perhaps only to be expected. China's relations with Japan, both Koreas and Vietnam, excuse me, are historically fraught, as are many other intra-Asian relationships between Japan and both Koreas, between Australia and Indonesia, between India and its neighbors, and between several members of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, to name just the main fault lines. I'm not going to discuss any of these disputes or complicated relationships in detail. I will leave that to question time. For now, just note that they exist and are a serious limitation to the idea of an Asian century insofar as that implies a minimal political coherence among Asians. In the early 20th century, the nationalist revolt against European colonialism provided mutual inspiration and a sense of common purpose, although not as much common action as the early nationalists hoped. Now that every Asian country is independent, Asian nationalisms, the plural is crucial, are more often than not directed against each other. Now, none of this is in any way intended to denigrate the Asian growth story upon which the idea of an Asian century ultimately rests, or to suggest that it is in any way illusionary. It is a real and inspiring story. There is no other example in history of so many people, hundreds of millions, particularly in the giant countries of China and India, lifted out of extreme poverty in a relatively short period of about 40 years since the 1980s. What made Asia different? While many, perhaps every country in every region in what we now call the Global South, talks about placing priority on economic development, few countries really mean it, at least in my experience. Their real priorities are too often elsewhere. And almost all the countries who really meant it were in Asia. This is the real Asian miracle. Much of what the World Bank described in a widely cited 1993 report on the East Asian miracle was, to my mind, largely standard macroeconomic policies open to all countries in all continents. What set Asian countries apart was political commitment to growth. Now, economic success is not specially vouchsafed to any Asian country by God. Although Asia will probably still grow faster than most other regions, the time of miracles is over, and all Asian countries will now have to grapple with thorny problems if they are to continue to grow and realize their potential. The politics of key Asian countries is becoming more complicated, and in some cases is becoming a hindrance to the single-minded focus that had hitherto characterized their approach to economic development. Here too, we are witnessing what could be termed a return to normalcy. China is not exempt from these trends. However, the challenges facing China are of a qualitatively different kind. Professor Yan Sui-tong of Tsinghua University has described the belief that China's rise was, and I quote, granted by nature. Granted by nature. The deep sense of entitlement that permeates that attitude, reinforced by the strongly ethno-nationalist narrative of humiliation, rejuvenation, and achieving the China dream, by which the Chinese Communist Party legitimates its monopoly of power, as well as a traditional political culture that equates order with hierarchy with China at the apex, drives the often counterproductive behavior that has aroused anxieties around the world, even in countries highly dependent on China. Even if not always publicly articulated, such anxieties are part of the new reality of Asia. These anxieties are the key drivers of developments such as the Quad, AUKUS, the sharp shift in Japan's strategic posture away from post-World War II pacifism, and India shifting away from purist notions of non-alignment, as well as quieter but no less significant shifts in the strategic approaches of key Southeast Asian countries. And this attitude, or something very similar, also lies at the core of China's slowing growth. The three interrelated challenges that confront China, a precarious property sector that accounts for a quarter or more of GDP, burgeoning local government debt with consequent stresses on commercial banking, and a lack of confidence that so far at least has limited the effectiveness of the measures Beijing has taken to deal with slow growth, are familiar and much discussed. But what is perhaps less well known or insufficiently discussed is that these issues are only economic in form and are symptoms of a much more fundamental political challenge. As early as 2007, then Premier Wen Jiabao warned that China's development was, and I quote him, unstable, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and ultimately unsustainable, end quote. In 2012, at its 18th Congress, the Chinese Communist Party acknowledged that the economic growth model that led to spectacular growth in the 1990s and the first decade of the 2000s was unsustainable. The next year, in 2013, the Chinese Communist Party rolled out a plan that envisaged a restructuring to allow the market to play a decisive role in the allocation of resources. That's a quote, a decisive role in the allocation of resources. In other words, more economic efficiency. Very little of this 2013 plan has been implemented. According to some academic studies, perhaps only 15 to 20%. Why? China is we sometimes forget, a communist country. Not so much in its ideology, but certainly in its political structure. It is a Leninist state led by a Leninist-style vanguard party. The primary value of a Leninist party is political control over all aspects of state, economy, and society. The most core of its core interest is to maintain control. The market, by definition, means less political control. What the 2013 plan required was a new balance between control and economic efficiency, and it is this new balance that the Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping has been reluctant to establish. In fact, the first decade of Xi Jinping's administration has seen the party under his leadership insisting on ever more control over the economy, state, and society, tilting the balance in the opposite direction to what the 2013 plan envisaged. Xi Jinping is clearly a true Leninist in that his almost Pavlovian response to problems seems to be more party. In the meantime, the expectations of the Chinese people have risen. At the 19th Party Congress in 2017, Xi himself acknowledged that the principal contradiction facing China was that between, and I quote, unbalanced and inadequate development and the people's ever-growing needs for a better life, end quotes. This has set out a lengthy domestic agenda to meet those expectations. Dealing with the agenda in a country of China's size will require immense resources over a long time. And this has set up something of a vicious circle. China must grow to acquire the resources to deal with rising expectations. Sustaining growth requires a new balance between political control and economic efficiency. Establishing that balance entails political risks. Mitigating risk requires growth, and so on and so on. China is not about to collapse. It is quite an adaptable system. But unless the party finds the political courage to break the vicious cycle, the Chinese economy is going to operate suboptimally. China will be pulled in contrary directions, as for example, it has been by passing a broadly encompassing espionage law, while Premier Li Qiang is trying to encourage foreign investment. Little wonder that China is facing a domestic and foreign crisis of confidence. Xi himself is the basic cause of the crisis of confidence. His record of admitting mistakes during his first decade in power is not encouraging. While Xi may make tactical adjustments to meet pressing immediate problems, as he did over zero COVID, fundamental changes during the further 10 to 15 years that Xi may remain in power seem unlikely. And by mid-century, whether or not Xi is still in power, long-term demographic factors will kick into slow growth. None of this means we have reached peak China, whatever that phrase may mean. Even if China grows at 4 or 5% annually, that is roughly equivalent to adding another Australia to the world economy every year. And that's not a bad peak, if indeed it is one. Whether that will be sufficient to satisfy China's external ambitions and domestic expectations are questions only time can answer. And if insufficient, only time will tell how a frustrated China will behave. But nobody is ever going to shun China, any more than anyone will shun India or Japan or South Korea or Indonesia, or for that matter, Brazil or South Africa or Nigeria or any big country anywhere, even if its economic performance is less than miraculous. As long as Asian economies, big and small, are performing relatively better than economies in other continents, that is reason enough to deal with them. And this moves us closer to the crux of what the idea of an Asian century really signifies. Asia now has to be dealt with in its own right and not as an accessory to some other concern. Not only insofar as it affects Europe as during the colonial era, or only as one of the arenas of US-Soviet competition during the Cold War, or as a blank sheet where protean abstractions such as democracy and authoritarianism advance or retreat, seemingly regardless of specific contexts of history and culture. Now, this cast of mind has led to serious policy mistakes. In Indochina during the 1960s and 70s, a civil war between competing variants of Vietnamese nationalism was mistaken for a move on the global strategic chessboard by international communism, another abstraction, and thus drew interventions by the US that had little regard for local dynamics, with very tragic results for the peoples of the countries enmeshed in the conflict. There is now a better understanding that China, India, Japan, both Koreas, Vietnam, Indonesia, to name but a few, are countries with long histories and deep pride in their cultures and are never going to be anybody's tool or play deputy to any sheriff. Even small countries like my own are never without agency and can use it. Otherwise, Singapore should not exist. I wouldn't be here talking to you. Of all countries in Europe, Switzerland should understand this. There is better understanding that Asia has to be dealt with on its own terms. But the mental transition from thinking of Asia only as an arena to thinking about Asia as an actor is still incomplete, as the continuing appeal of the conceit of an Asian century itself demonstrates. Simplistic binaries such as contrasting an Asian century with the American century or the starker Chinese version of East rising, West declining, objectifies the countries involved, brushes aside their diversity, and reduces them to mere representations of whatever larger forces may strike one's fancy. My former colleague, Kishore Mahbubani, former colleague in the Foreign Ministry, Kishore Mahbubani, one of the most ardent promoters of the Asian century idea, has even gone so far as to argue that, and I quote him, the last 2 centuries of Western domination of world history have been a major historical aberration. From the years 1 to 1820, the 2 largest economies of the world were those of China and India. All historical aberrations come to a natural end. Therefore, the Asian century is irresistible and unstoppable. End quote. Now, Kishore is probably right that China and India were the world's largest economies centuries ago. But of what relevance is that today? It's a debating point that sounds clever but proves nothing and is misleading. To conceive of the Asian century as the recovery of Asia's historical place in the world prior to contact with the West echoes the Chinese line of rejuvenation and completely ignores the profound changes that the West and Asia have wrought on each other through centuries of interaction. Former Chinese Foreign Minister, now disappeared, Qin Gang, has boasted that China had, and I quote him, shattered the myth that modernization is Westernization. This claim, which also underpins Xi Jinping's global civilization initiative, is at best only partially true. The myth was shattered long ago and not by China. China's general development trajectory is not essentially different from that of Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, India, Vietnam, Indonesia, or any other example of successful modernization and development. Modernization has always necessarily entailed Westernization. Westernization spelt with a lowercase w, and never Westernization spelt with an uppercase W as Qin Gang did. That is to say, it had always involved adapting the ideas and techniques of Western industrial society to local conditions for a very simple reason. Because until Japan developed after the Meiji Restoration, all modern industrial societies were Western. The only choice was the US-European model, which stressed the market economy and liberal democracy based on the individual, or the Soviet-Russian model, which emphasized the planned economy and people's democracy, in which the individual is subordinate to the vanguard party. China's choice was the latter. But as I sometimes remind my Chinese friends, Marx, Engels, and Lenin are not ancient Chinese sages. And adding the phrase with Chinese characteristics cannot erase the strong Western influence on China since 1911 and which continued after 1949. Whatever the choice, there were always national particularities that could not be brushed aside. From Meiji Japan to the present day, the most successful non-Western modernizers have never been mere carbon copies of either model. They are all adaptations to local conditions. China is only a particular case of a general phenomenon and unique only in the trite sense that every country is unique. More crucially, to conceive of the Asian century as reclaiming a place held in the past ignores the very reason for Asia's economic success. If Asian countries have generally adapted better to Western-defined modernity and grown faster than countries in other non-Western regions, it is because they have more thoroughly enmeshed themselves into the world economy and occupied some of its most important nodes. China is itself the prime example of this phenomenon. Underpinning this system is the foundation of stability provided by American power. Insofar as modern Asia is characterized by economic success, there can be no Asian century without America. Does this make the US Asian? Well, geography is never just geography, but it's always, at least to some degree, politically determined. The very terms Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific and forums like the East Asia Summit and APEC implicitly recognize that to deal with either China or the US effectively, you must deal with both simultaneously. Without the US, there can be no balance to China, and we will deal with China in a heavily unbalanced strategic environment that can only be detrimental to our interests. Without China, the risk that the US will take our interests for granted and disregard them rises considerably. Uncontrolled strategic competition between the US and China is thus of grave concern to all Asian countries. Indeed, should be of concern to all countries, including US allies and partners who have their own concerns about Chinese behavior. If US-China competition gets out of hand, it potentially reduces the space to deal with both simultaneously. Now, US-China strategic competition is a new structural condition of international relations that will shape many issues in all regions for decades to come. All the more reason to understand its nature precisely so as to be able to position ourselves optimally. One of the most intellectually lazy tropes used to describe US-China competition is to call it a new Cold War. This fundamentally misrepresents the nature of US-China competition because it evokes a superficially plausible but in fact inappropriate historical analogy. The Cold War was an existential struggle between capitalism and communism. The US and the Soviet Union led two separate systems connected with each other only at their margins. Although the prospect of nuclear destruction tempered their rivalry and eventually led to détente, to the very end, in principle if not always in practice, the essential aim of US-Soviet competition was for one system to replace the other. But the US and China are today both vital, irreplaceable parts of a single global system, intimately enmeshed with each other and the rest of the world by a web of supply chains of a scope, of a density, and of a complexity that is historically unprecedented. The very metaphor of a chain understates the complexity, because a chain is an essentially simple linear structure. A more appropriate metaphor is the root system of a tree, leading to its trunk, leading to branches, twigs, and leaves. The global system comprises a thick forest of trees intertwined with each other across continents. That forest was planted and spread during the short post-Cold War period of unchallenged American dominance. It is now an established fact in its own right. Its consequences are what we now call globalization and interdependence. There had, of course, been earlier periods of interdependence between rival major powers, but nothing exactly like this complex forest has ever existed before. This is what distinguishes 21st century interdependence from earlier periods of interdependence. And this has blurred the line between the West and the rest. Asia is deeply integrated into this forest, and that line is less distinct in Asia than elsewhere. It has also made it difficult to neatly characterize even the most complicated intra-Asian relationship as friend or foe. Attitudes towards China, even in countries that have active disputes with China, are ambivalent. The US and China are both uncomfortable with their interdependence because it exposes their mutual vulnerabilities. Both have tried to mitigate these vulnerabilities, the US and its allies, by trying to enhance the resilience of key sectors by diversification of their most important supply chains to reduce dependence on China, and by denying China key technologies. China by trying to become more technologically self-reliant and placing more emphasis on domestic consumption to drive growth. Neither will succeed, at least not to the extent they hope. Diversification and self-reliance are both easier said than done. And even if these strategies work, which is open to question, it will take a long time to have a significant effect. Now, partial bifurcation of the system has already occurred, and there will be further bifurcation, particularly in areas of technology and finance with security implications. And this certainly places pressures on globalization and is difficult to deal with. But apocalyptic scenarios of this exceptionally complex global system dividing across all sectors into two separate systems as existed during the US-Soviet Cold War lack credibility. Unless a full-scale war between the US and China breaks out, which is improbable, globalization will be patchy and will slow down but will not be reversed. However deep there are concerns about China, even the closest American ally is never going to cut itself off from China politically or economically. This reality was recognized by the change of Western rhetoric from decoupling to de-risking. On its part, the slogan of dual circulation acknowledges Beijing's reliance on exports. China's most important markets are ultimately in the developed countries, not the global south. And despite all the tensions and the disruptions to trade, the total volume of US-China trade was more than US dollars 690 billion last year. The US and China will compete and do so robustly, but they will compete within the single system of which they are both vital parts. The dynamics of competition within a system are fundamentally more complex than the binary competition between systems as existed during the US-Soviet Cold War. In complexity, there is maneuver space and more opportunity to exercise agency. More crucially, competition within a system is not existential, because the aim is not to destroy the system and replace it with another. China may want to dominate the system and may be motivated by dreams of regaining its real or imagined former place in Asia and the world, but those are different matters. As one of the main beneficiaries of the existing system, Beijing has no strong incentive to totally upset it or seek radically different arrangements, even assuming it has the capability to do so, which is not to be assumed. Now, China is certainly revanchist and very assertively so, but to call it revisionist or a systemic competitor is, to my mind, to overstate the case. But facing no existential threat anywhere in the world, why should the US continue to bear any burden or pay any price to uphold international order? Why should it? After 40 years of sacrifice, the priorities of all post-Cold War US administrations have been domestic, with the George W. Bush administration as an exception forced by 9/11. This is not so much a return to isolationism, another inappropriate historical analogy. The 1990s and 2000s are not the 1920s and 1930s. A more accurate description of the American attitude would be a unilateral recalibration of the terms of America's engagement with the world. America now defines its international interests, its external interests, more narrowly and more transactionally. In this respect, the primary difference between the Trump and Bush and Biden administrations was that the latter was politer and more predictable about its transactionalism. True, Mr. Biden is more consultative than Mr. Trump, but Mr. Biden is not consulting any of us for the pleasure of our company, but to see what we are prepared to do to advance his agenda. Post-Cold War America expects and demands more of its allies, partners, and friends. This new reality has not yet been fully internalized, although Asia perhaps understands it somewhat better than Europe because Asia's relationships with the US has always rested more on common interests rather than the illusion of common values. Still in Asia as elsewhere, debates about the reliability of the US have resurfaced, given a sharper edge now that wars in Ukraine and Gaza have underscored America's indispensability. Anxieties are enhanced by the more than usual polarization of American politics and the angst that this has engendered among the traditional American elite that we are all familiar with. But there is only one America, and each country will have to decide for itself what it is, and more equally important, is not prepared to do with the US to maintain regional balances. Ladies and gentlemen, I've tried your patience by speaking for too long. Let me now wrap up by drawing together the main threads of my argument and relate them to the question I posed at the beginning. Can this be the Asian century? I hope the layers of complexity that swathe the apparently straightforward idea of an Asian century are now clearer. As we try to navigate these complexities, we are confronted with two fundamental strategic realities. First, the US and China are geopolitical facts that no country can ignore. Second, there are concerns about both American and Chinese behavior. Faced with these realities, most countries are going to try to maximize strategic flexibility within the constraints of their specific circumstances. No country anywhere, even former US allies or those economically dependent on China, will want to align all their interests across all domains in one direction or another. They will try to align different interests in different domains in the most advantageous direction. Since all countries face the same imperative, no country's choices need be confined to only the US or China. The US and China may be the most important actors, but they are not the only potential partners. What I see evolving as the 21st century progresses is what I call a system of dynamic multipolarity. The US-China relationship will be the main axis around which eclectic groups of countries will continually form, dissolve, and reconstitute themselves in different coalitions on different issues as their interests dictate. Each coalition will have different participants and leaders. Some may include both the US and China, some one or the other, and some neither. These ever-shifting coalitions will not displace existing alliances, institutions, and forums, but form an overlay that shapes their dynamics and in turn will be shaped by them. There are several developments that already point in that direction. Japan taking the initiative to form the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, after the Trump administration renounced the Trans-Pacific Partnership. India's concerns about China leading it to abandon purist notions of non-alignment to join the Quad. But those concerns not preventing India from also joining the China-led Shanghai Cooperation Organization. India left ASEAN-led RCEP, but along with the US, China, and Russia, among others, is part of other ASEAN-initiated forums such as the East Asia Summit and the ASEAN Defense Ministers Plus meeting. Asia's diversity makes it a naturally multipolar region. Since Asia is also the epicenter of the broad shifts driving dynamic multipolarity, the rise of China and India, the deep and pervasive influence of US-China competition, and Asia's increasingly important role in the global web of supply chains, among others, Asia will be the testbed for the emerging new system, which I believe will eventually spread to other geographic regions. In this sense, Asia as a model may well come to define an Asian century. But such a fluid and multifaceted system cannot be geographically constrained. The trends that are driving the evolution of such a system are global. Implicit in all I have said is that conventional geography is becoming less relevant as an indicator of political or strategic alignment. Membership of many of the forums and institutions I have mentioned is already not confined to Asia. The US is a member of the East Asia Summit. Japan, Australia, and South Korea have attended the NATO Summit. The UK, to give another recent example, joined the CPTPP in March this year. I doubt it will be the last European state to seek membership. This cannot be a purely Asian century. We are too often trapped in a binary mode of thought that limits our strategic horizons. But does everything really need to be only one thing or another? I don't think so. And on that perhaps somewhat enigmatic note, I shall end. And if you find my conclusion unsatisfactory, I beg you to remember that Schrodinger's cat was simultaneously alive and dead. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for listening to me, and I end by reminding you that I have no official position in the Singapore government. My only official position is that of pensioner. Thank you.
That was quite a ride. Okay. Thank you so much. I hope I speak for all of us when I say this was incredibly insightful. You covered an amazing amount of ground, and we like to joke at Asia Study Switzerland that this is the hardest assignment that we could think of, is because the only thing we tell is that, we want you to talk about the state of Asia and nothing more, and you have 35 minutes, and that's it. And I think you did a fantastic job. So I just want to follow up on a few points, and then we're going to make sure to have enough time for questions. I do apologize in advance if we can't get around to anyone's questions. I'm sure there are a few. You spent quite a bit of your talk talking about the US and China and about their ongoing competition. And you said at one point, the US-Chinese competition is a new structural reality, and the US and China are both geopolitical realities. We can't wish them away. They're not going to go away. They're going to stay here. So I want to take this idea of a country being a geopolitical reality and ask whether you think it could be extended to a third country, and that's India. We talked a little bit about India, but I think, if there's a third actor that could deserve the term geopolitical reality, it would be India. So my question to you is India already a geopolitical reality for the world? Is it maybe partially a reality? And what would it need to do to really become one?
Well, India is obviously a geopolitical reality. I think I can best answer your question by drawing a fundamental distinction between big countries and small countries. Again, this is something that should resonate with a Swiss audience. Now, big countries have an intrinsic relevance to the world. Whether they do stupid things or clever things, they are relevant. Particularly if they do stupid things, they are even more relevant because of the damage they can do. But small countries are intrinsically irrelevant. Take my country. Singapore is a global trading center, a logistics center, a port, and so on. But we have played those roles. Even before there were states in the modern sense of the term, we have played those roles as a British colony. We have played those roles as part of Malaysia under Japanese occupation in the Second World War, and now as independent state. In other words, there is nothing that says that we have to be sovereign and independent in order to play those roles. For small countries, relevance is not to be assumed, it is an artifact to be created by human endeavor and maintained by human endeavor. Now, India is a big country. Brazil is a big country, South Africa, Nigeria, you name it, right? So they have an intrinsic relevance. Now, India is growing, but it's obviously not in the same league or category as the US and China. It might reach there one day, but it will have to grow faster. It has many internal problems. India is a huge and complicated country. It's, in fact, a continent. It's several countries. Each Indian state is bigger than most countries in the world, right? And just to hold that big country together requires a lot of effort, political effort, intellectual effort, and therefore a big country like that more naturally looks inwards than outwards. It is changing, that is changing, but it's changing at its own pace. It's a very complicated country. It will get there, but it is already a geopolitical fact that cannot be ignored. It's what we talked about this before, Nico. I call it an existential power. Just by existing, it has an influence. And big countries are like that. Small countries like ours, I'm afraid we'll have to work harder.
You also briefly touched upon, when we talk about the large countries, the relationship between the two largest countries on the planet, China and India. And you had this very interesting quote, I think it was from an article that Xi Jinping published in The Hindu on occasion of his visit to India. And of course, what he said is the nice thing someone says when he goes to visit another country. But it's still striking, if we take this as a starting point, how badly the relationship has developed, and sort of how we are now at the point where I think one of the better words to describe the India-China relationship is as clearly antagonistic. So my question is, was the idea that Xi Jinping had or claimed to have had in the Hindu of an India-China collaboration, was this ever in the cards? Or was it in a way inevitable that the two largest countries on the planet, both of which were growing and developing and wanted to become more assertive in the planet, would eventually clash?
Well, if you remember, Just after Indian independence and China, after 1949, there was this slogan of India and China are brothers. Then they fought a war in 1962, and then they tried to spend the ensuing decades doing their best to ignore each other, interacting only on the margins, as little as possible. Well, that's not possible today. India and China's economic interdependence, despite their political antagonism, which I will agree with you, is real. Look at the trade statistics and so on. And despite the restrictions India has put on Chinese investment and so on, it's still quite healthy. Right? But it's always been a puzzle to me. It's not a puzzle to me that big countries should be in competition. That is more natural. But it seems to me that since 2014, when there was a lot of optimism on both sides, China seems to have gone out of its way to destroy that optimism. Why? How is this in interest of China or India? I'm not saying that all responsibility is on China and India. There are no angels in international relations. Okay, that's my starting point. Except, of course, small countries like ours. And we are only angelic because we have to be.
Yeah. What you're saying, in effect, is the angels are irrelevant.
Angels, well, if they exist, they are not very relevant. But the kinds of things that have been going on that border, often initiated by China, baffled me as to why they are in Chinese interests. No, I can understand you don't want to give up the borders, there's a dispute, that's quite normal. But why must you go out of your way to do things? Whereas if you just leave it be, leave the line of actual control there, you had a stable relationship. That stable relationship after 1962, I told you a bit facetiously that they spent a lot of time trying to ignore each other, and that line of actual control was fairly stable, right? Nothing was settled, but there was no incidents, or very rarely, right? Now suddenly, by my very rough count, since 2014, there's been roughly at least one major incident a year. And if you count minor ones that don't get reported, probably much more. Why? I don't know. I have no answer. It's one of the baffling things. But I do think it is this kind of behavior, not just in the Himalayas, but South China Sea, East China Sea, is driven by that very entitled revanchist narrative of humiliation, rejuvenation, and attaining the China dream, by which the Communist Party legitimates its monopoly of power. Now, it's very hard to deal, if they will believe in this, it's very hard to settle anything diplomatically. Because if I say, what I'm saying is, this was all mine, by the way, and it was taken from me, I lost it when I was weak, so I'm just taking back what was mine. So what's there to discuss then? Right? And it's a very small step from saying that I'm just recovering, this was mine, and and India or Japan or Vietnam or some countries acting unreasonably by trying to hang on to something that is not theirs. It's a very small step to saying you are behaving very unreasonably to the Chinese people who drank this Kool-Aid and believe it, saying, oh, then the government is not acting forcefully enough to defend China's interests. And from the government not acting forcefully, it is a very smaller step to say the party is weak, and that they cannot tolerate. So there is a certain inherent dynamic towards counterproductive behavior in that very... I've told my Chinese friends, you are a big country, you are going to be a great country, but a great country does not have a narrative only of victimization. You have to stand for something more positive. Right? But they don't seem to get it. I don't know why. No, it doesn't mean that okay, the idea of an American dream, there's a lot of bullshit in it. We all know this, right? But at least it's a positive narrative that other people can join on. This is a very Chinese narrative. Only Chinese will be interested in the rejuvenation of China and attaining the Chinese dream. But there are many Chinese dreams, and Mr. Xi's definition of them is not shared by every Chinese. And so you start from a very false premise that leads you into dead ends. But you can't get out of it because you have who believes in class struggle in China anymore, right? Probably there are more people in this university who believe in class struggle than in China. Okay. So they have nothing else but this legitimating narrative, and it traps them. They use it, they fear it.
One thing you said that I really liked is that you said the real Asian miracle is that a lot of the Asian countries for a really long time had a strong political commitment to growth and globalization.
Yeah.
And that's what made them successful, and that's what led to above average growth. And you also said, and I think that's really crucial, that there's nothing inherently special about Asian countries. Policy is always a choice, and the choice would have been open to many other countries on the planet, yet they didn't pick it. And so, while I think you spent quite a bit of time talking about Asia being diverse, and I think that's a really crucial and generally underappreciated point, there has to be something, right? So there has to be something that led the Asian countries to be more politically motivated, more politically committed to growth than maybe other countries that were not in Asia. Do you have an explanation of why we saw that Asian miracle?
I have an explanation. It's an extremely politically incorrect one.
Excellent.
All the Asian countries, at the crucial stage of their growth, were various degrees of dictatorships. So their legitimacy was not a procedural legitimacy, it was a performance legitimacy. They had to deliver. Because even I'm not saying dictatorships lead to growth, right? If that was true, then North Korea would be the most prosperous country on earth, right? And that's obviously not true, right? But because they could not rely, as most Western countries and Japan after Second World War, rely on procedural legitimacy. They had to rely on performance legitimacy. They had to deliver. You can't rule by the fist all the time. You have to get some support. I think that's my simple politically incorrect. And that's why I said now that they have become democracies, and bear in mind that's a Protean term, there are many types of democracies, but their politics have become more complicated, including my own countries. You can't have that single-minded focus on one dimension growth. I mean, there are a lot of young people in Singapore, and I don't blame them. They say we are now rich, so we should be able to enjoy the nicer things in life, like the arts, music, dance, and so on. And it's true, because what's the point of we're not Scrooge, right? Hoarding the money away for nothing. But they forget that arts, painting, music, poetry, and all that, these are not investments. These are consumption. It has to be funded somehow. And so even while you enjoy the good life, somebody has got to be making the money so that we can enjoy the good life. And so the single-minded focus that characterized the early period of let's say just the four little dragons, 70s, late 60s, 70s, 80s, that's over now. The politics of all of them, even a country like Vietnam, has become much more complicated. A country like Singapore, a country like Indonesia, it's been pulled in different directions. There are many virtues to democracy, and I'm not suggesting, I'm not nostalgic for the past, but there are also disadvantages because it makes it difficult to focus on one goal over the long run. Now, that is undoubtedly an advantage that authoritarian systems have. They can focus on one goal and pursue it. I can't imagine something like what Deng Xiaoping did, occurring in any pluralistic society. What did he do? He spent his life pursuing communism. One day he looked around, he said this is all going wrong, and he made a 180-degree turn with relatively little opposition and changed the world. That can only happen in an authoritarian system. But that ability of authoritarian systems to set and pursue goals over the long term is an advantage only if the goal you set is the correct one in the first place. And that's not always the case, even in China's case. Deng Xiaoping's goal was correct. Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution, disasters, right? And it takes disaster for Deng Xiaoping to be able to change things. Well, democracies are messy, but we are often inefficient. Even illiberal democracies, which I would not deny we are messy and getting messier. So it's harder to get a domestic consensus on a particular direction. But once you have it, you may not be able to perform as brilliantly as before, but you're not going to make disastrous mistakes either, because there's a certain self-correction. That is my simple answer to your deceptively simple question.
I do like asking these. I have another deceptively simple question, and then we're going to open for deceptively simple questions from the audience. So I think one of the key lines going through your speech tonight is this development that we're seeing from Asia, and I think you said at the very beginning, very rightfully so, all the caveats that we need to keep in mind when we use that term. As Asia being perceived in the West as an accessory, to Asia being, sort of becoming an actor in its own right, to Asia even becoming a model for this new form of international relations that you termed dynamic multipolarity. I think you did a fantastic job explaining how dynamic multipolarity looks like, how we're already seeing this developing. I think you made a really good case for this being the future. So I'm just going to ask you this: how and when will it end?
Heaven knows. I don't think you are going to see a very neat denouement as you saw during US-Soviet competition, because this is not an existential competition in the first place. There will be a lot of fluidity, and we shouldn't get too excited. Sometimes it will appear that the US is ahead, sometimes the US will fall behind in certain domains. It'll be messy. But it's not going to end in any clear-cut way as the real Cold War ended. I don't think we should, in international relations, one thing I've learned is that there are no definitive solutions to many problems. And in fact, trying to find definitive solutions sometimes causes more harm than good. What you can do is manage international problems, and this can be managed. It is in the process of being managed. It's not completely well managed yet, the US-China competition and all the rest of us. But I don't think the US and China are out looking for trouble. Now, neither of them is going to roll over and let the other tickle its tummy. This is not how major powers behave, okay? But they are not looking for trouble. They have their own problems, China in particular. They won't give up the competition, but they're not going out of the way to seek trouble. I think the risks in US-China competition is not war or conflict by design, meaning war or conflict, because war has certain specific meanings. Conflict used as an instrument of policy, like what Mr. Putin tried to do in Ukraine but botched up completely, right? I don't think that's the risk. The risk is an accident getting out of hand. The accident getting out of hand on the Chinese side because of that narrative I told you, where it's very simple, where it's very easy to move from trying to be, where compromise can be easily read as weakness by your own people. And that, in a different way, also is on the American side and in many countries. There's no leader that wants to go down history as a weak leader, right? Big country is a small country. So I think that's the danger. Something happens in the Taiwan Strait, and you'll get out of hand. Now, look, 2001, you remember, some of you remember the EP-3 incident, where a Chinese fighter collided with an American surveillance aircraft. The Chinese fighter pilot was killed. The American aircraft crash-landed on Hainan Island. Now, it was handled relatively well because the both sides tried to handle it very well. Right? I don't think that is possible today in the age of social media, even in a highly controlled society like China. Right? You can't keep it under wraps. You can't control the narrative, to use that term, which I actually hate, but I find no other alternative but to use it these days. So if something like that happens again, they will try their best to keep it within parameters. But whether they will succeed is now a much more open question than it was, 22 years ago. That's the big risk.
Thank you.